We're doing this Maamar backwards. We did the last few prakim in the first shir. We did the middle two prakim, beginning with Sif Dalad in the second shir. Now we're doing the beginning. What we're going to do now is learn the Maamar inside and read the questions that the Rebbe has and answer them as we go. In other words, the Maamar is long. What I would like to do tonight is learn the Maamar and right away give you the answers so that it's consolidated, it's concentrated, it's immediate, and you don't have to go through the whole biur as we discussed it in the last 2 weeks. Okay, now just bear in mind, this is the first Purim of the Rebbe's Nesias. This is the first Purim Maamar the Rebbe said, as a Rebbe, as a Yossi. It's literally 35 days after Yud Shvat. And it's the fourth or the fifth Maamar the Rebbe said. And by the way, I don't know if I mentioned this when I gave the introduction, but the Rebbe was asked by Rabbi Khan that he should write his own Maamorim. They found 2 manuscripts, 2 Kisvei Yad Kodesh of the Rebbe trying to write a Maamar. One I think is Kisisa, and the other is this Vkibel Hayehudim. The Rebbe started writing, and very quickly he began to summarize, to write in the Kodesh. Apparently for the Rebbe it was difficult to write the Maamar because of the time constraints that he had, or whatever the case was. But this Maamar, a part of it is available in the Rebbe's own Kisvei Yad Kodesh as the Rebbe began to write it. And of course it's based on a very important Maamar. It's based on the Maamar the previous Rebbe said, Purim Kotten Shnas Prozes, in 1927, about 4 months before his arrest. He traveled to Moscow to meet Dr. Rosen, who was the representative of the joint in Russia. I think he was an American Jew. And the Rebbe came clandestinely. They came secretly. No one was allowed to know he was there, and so on. Chassidim found out he was there and invited to come to speak in the Lubavitcher Shul. The Rebbe said he couldn't refuse them. So he went, and the way it's described is the shul was packed, and people were out into the street. And when the Rebbe said the Maamar, he said it so loud that everybody out in the street could hear his voice clearly. And he said that Maamar Vkibel Hayehudim. And of course, as we know, the Maamar that the Rebbe said then was about Mesiras Nefesh. And he primarily spoke about the Nikis Shel Beis Rabban, about little children learning Torah on the times of Mesiras Nefesh and so forth. So as you know, this Maamar of our Rebbe is not so focused on the idea of Mesiras Nefesh, although Mesiras Nefesh is certainly a basic part of the Maamar. The point of this Maamar is to explain the relationship between the Mesiras Nefesh and Torah. This Maamar is a Torah Maamar. So let's begin. Vkibel Hayehudim eis asher echelu lasis. The Jewish people affirmed or accepted again this that they had started to do by Har Sinai. And the Frierdiker Rebbe explains. In his Maamar, which begins with this prefix, with this pasuk, which the Rebbe had just printed for Purim of 1951 of Tafshin Yud Aleph, that the Jewish people accepted a second time this that they had started to accept when the Eibusha gave us the Torah 1,000 years earlier. When the Jewish people said at Har Sinai, Nasa v'nishma, we will do and we will hear. And of course, Chassidus explained that this is the idea of Kabbalah, Seil Malchus Shamayim, and Kabbalah, Seil Mitzvahs, and later on in the Maamar. Nasa v'nishma is going to be called Mesiras Nefesh B'koyach. Says the previous Rebbe, that was only a beginning. They started last days to do. At the time of Achashverosh, during the decree of Haman, which is almost precisely 1,000 years after Matan Torah, there was a final reacceptance. Vkibel Hayehudim. This is the pshat in the pasuk. So the previous Rebbe then goes ahead and asks the question. The previous Rebbe's question is, it's wondrous, it's strange, it's odd. How could it be that Purim would culminate, Purim would complete something which had started at Har Sinai, meaning that in a certain aspect, Purim was greater than Har Sinai? Why is it a wonder? When the Eibusha gave us the Torah, the Jews stood in the highest possible state. First of all, in Begashmi is physically, that they were they were in a very, very good condition, very praiseworthy condition. Binyan acheres in terms of freedom. They were independent, they were out of Mitzrayim, they owned themselves, they were subservient to no one, and so on. V'hein beruchnis as well as spiritually, shehoya oz etzlam. That the Jewish people at that time had Gili alakus, the revelation of godliness. Bedarga chi nailis, in the very highest of levels. So Matan Torah was an event which took place in an ideal circumstance. Ubimei Achashverosh, and the times of Achashverosh, hoyu yisrael b'tachas hayirida. The Jewish people found themselves in the lowest possible state, and the Rebbe develops just how low that state was. First of all, the Neiseh, first of all, the Hayehudim v'hestesha b'chol Golus. It was exile, Golus. And what do we know about Golus? Such a cheshech echasa eretz, darkness covers the earth. Beribit tzimtzumim v'alamas v'esteirim, many contractions and hiddennesses and concealments. So every Golus is a negative condition. And of course, you know what it says in Chassidus about Golus. That Golus means you find yourself in a situation where your spark of godliness is trapped, and you cannot redeem it, you cannot release it. Ein chavosh mater es atzmei v'eiso asurim. The condition of being in Golus is like a person is in jail, and the cell is locked, and he doesn't have the key, because if you have the key, and you can take yourself out of Golus, if you choose to remain in Golus, it's not a Golus. So Golus means Kayachal, the Eibishter is limited, that he can't reveal himself, and the key, so to speak, is not by him. And in addition, not only were the Jewish people in Golus, because of the idea of Golus in general, but more specifically, because of the decrees of Haman. The hiddenness and the concealments were even more. That Haman made Gzeiris. First of all, he was going to kill all the Jewish people who were called Yehudim. And in addition, he made decrees against learning Torah and doing mitzvahs in the weeks and months leading up to the day on which he intended on killing all the Jewish people. So the Jewish people were spiritually in a very compromised condition. V'gam b'gashmi, materially as well. The Jewish people found themselves in a condition which was very, very, very lowly. And what's the proof? There was actually a decree to annihilate and to kill and to make disappear, God forbid. That's called Hayehudim. All the Jewish people called Yehudim, minar v'adzakin, tavenoshim, young and old, women and children and women. But yemechad, on one day. So, in the time of Purim, it wasn't a theory, it was an actual fact that this decree was made, and the fact that this decree was made gives you an idea of the place the Jewish people held in the world. So both spiritually and physically, Har Sinai was on a much higher madrega than Purim, and therefore the question becomes, nevertheless, Bisman Matan Torah, when the Eibishter gave us the Torah, when the Jewish people were on the highest madrega, spiritually and also materially, that means in terms of freedom, Hahaschala was only a beginning, Ubizman Gzeiras Haman, and the time of the decree of Haman. The Jewish people in the lowest possible state, Oz Dafke, then emphatically Dafke Kiblu. Was there a final affirmation and commitment to Mashe Chelu, this that had started b'Matan Torah, when the Eibishter gave us the Torah? So the previous Rebbe's big question is, how can Purim complement Matan Torah? Purim was such a difficult time for the Jewish people. Matan Torah was such an ideal time for the Jewish people. And how could Purim possibly complement Matan Torah? This is the question. Just the previous Rebbe answers the question. Shebizman Agzeira, in the time of Purim, when the Jewish people were experiencing this decree, and their lives stood in the balance, their fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs involved b'mesiras nefesh, sacrifice. And as you'll see, Mitzvah soon, and we discussed this 2 weeks ago, that there's Mesiras Nefesh B'Koyach, which is Nasav and Ishma. There's Mesiras Nefesh Mitzad HaNeshama B'Peil, which is Chanukah, which has a Cheshbon. And there's Mesiras Nefesh B'Peil, Mitzad HaGuf, which is Purim, which is Hefker. In other words, it's the ultimate level of Mesiras Nefesh. And that's why Purim, in as much as it's the ultimate level of Mesiras Nefesh, is able to complete the event of Matan Torah, as you'll see soon. It adds the Rebbe, it says in the Maamar, that the Yidden's Mesiras Nefesh at that time was he only if they would have traded in their faith for another faith. Nothing would have been done to them. The decree was against Jews, Yehudim. Nevertheless, not one single Jew thought about departing from that status. So there was an inyan of Mesiras Nefesh. And of course, we talked about this, and I believe there's a Sikha from the Friedrich Rebbe, Purim Tafshin Aleph, where this idea is developed at length. That the traditional name of the Jewish people was Ivri, Yivrei in Russian, Hebrew. And when the Jewish people went to Bavel, the Hebrews went to Bavel, and they arrived in Bavel, they were seen as Hebrews. The word Hebrew, the word Ivri, also means an immigrant, a foreigner. Like it does in the Chazal, that the word Ivri means Me'ever Achar, from the other side of the river. But when the Jewish people arrived in Bavel, they were very, very intelligent, they were very handsome, they were very beautiful, and the Babylonians embraced them. And they were taken into Nebuchadnezzar's cabinet, and they were assimilated into the society, and there was even a very significant percentage of Jewish people who, God forbid, intermarried. In other words, life was good in Galus. So the Jews who cared about principle changed their name. They took a new title for themselves. Instead of being called Ivri, they took the title Yehudi. And Yehudi does not mean from Shevet Yehuda. The most famous of all the Yehudim is Mordechai himself, Mordechai from Shevet Binyamin. The meaning of the word Yehudi, as the Gemara says, it is a kefer ba'aveda zara, denying idol worship. And the Rebbe would very often quote this Gemara and add that if someone is kefer ba'aveda zara, is a bederech memela meida b'chol ha'teira kula. If you deny idol worship, you're automatically conceding and accepting and admitting the veracity, the truth of the entire Torah. And that's the meaning of the word Yehudi. I once had a Jew challenge me, how come we're called Jew, we're not all from Shevet Yehuda? I was a kid, I didn't have an answer, but the answer is because the word Jew does not mean from Shevet Yehuda. The word Jew means I'm principled in my Jewishness, and I'm prepared to give my life for it. So the Chiddush of this Alter Rebbe, which has very, very few sources in Midrash Chazal, is that Haman wasn't killing Jews like Hitler. Hitler killed Jews no matter what. He killed non-Jews because they had a certain percentage of Jewish blood. Haman killed only religious Jews, and the defiant ones. So any Jew could get out of losing his life by becoming undefiant. And yet they stood in their defiance, and in fact Jews who were more assimilated joined the ranks of the defiant, became Yehudim, and there was a rock-hard dedication to Hashem that even if they would lose their lives, they wouldn't budge from their position. And that's what makes Purim so extraordinary. There's an incredible amount of Mesiras Nefesh. Three lines from the top, he explains, when we speak about the Jewish people at that time, having Mesiras Nefesh, there's a number of aspects, there's a number of parts to it. Number one, the first level of Mesiras Nefesh is that they would not deny God, they would not rebel against the belief in one God, which is, of course, a core belief that a Jew cannot and will not. The famous Lashon, a Yid will nicht kann werden abgerissen vergettlichkeit. Neither wishes to nor is capable of becoming separate from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And this is what happened at that time. No Jew would rebel, would trade in their belief in HaKadosh Baruch Hu for something else. But there was more. There was a Mesiras Nefesh for the fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs. Meaning, in other words, Haman made more than one decree. He made a decree to kill the Yehudim on 13 Adar in the next year. But he made a decree also that you're not allowed to practice Torah and mitzvahs, and you can get killed before that date if you would. And in footnote 13, the Rebbe says, and by the way, this shtikel, Maamar, you have almost word for word in the V'yata Tetzaveh, where he also speaks about Purim, and he develops it also on these several levels of Mesiras Nefesh. The idea that Jewish people, would be Mesiras Nefesh for the fulfillment of Torah mitzvahs is a greater novelty than being Mesiras Nefesh not to become cut off from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. When it touches faith, it says in Tanya chapter 18 and 19, Gam Kal Shabakala Mesiras Nefesh. Every Jew is Mesiras Nefesh because the Pintel Yid emerges, because the Ruach Shtus. It says in chapter 24, Ruach Shtus is Magia Ad Bechin Chachma Sheba Nefesh. V'layad Bechlal, there's a point in the Neshama which can never be in Golos, a point in the Neshama which can never be in the Ruach Shtus. It can only be Shina, and when you wake it up, because Kiyashana Deshem, a Yid is Mesiras Nefesh. But that's for the Nekudas HaYadus, for the Iker, not to go against the HaKadosh Baruch Hu fundamentally. But Torah and mitzvahs in the daily life is not included in that. And that year they had Mesiras Nefesh for Torah and mitzvahs as well. And the third level of Mesiras Nefesh was Shekilu Kilas Barab. They gathered large groups of Jewish people together. Lil Meteira b'Mesiras Nefesh, to learn Torah with Mesiras Nefesh, which is also outlawed. So there's three levels to the Mesiras Nefesh of Purim. The Mesiras Nefesh about not to be Kefer Be'ikir. The Mesiras Nefesh for Torah and Mitzvahs. Mesiras Nefesh do it in a very, very public way. And this is the explanation for why Purim is greater than Matan Torah, you'll see later on. But he adds, V'seider some Mesiras Nefesh Alehem, the arousal of this Mesiras Nefesh, Hoisai de Mordechai Hayehudi. Although it came from the Yiddish Neshamas, but it was aroused by their leader, by their Rebbe, by their Nasi, which is Mordechai. Who, as the Medrash says, was Meisha Shabbatei, the Meisha of his generation. Shehikil Kilas Barabim, he was the one who gathered large groups of Jewish people together, Lechazek Amunos, to strengthen their faith. Now later on in the Maamar, that means on page Ayin Zayin, near the bottom of the page, the Rebbe says an unbelievable thing. That if Yidden would have Mesiras Nefesh without Mordechai, the Mesiras Nefesh would involve sacrifice. But when Yidden have Mesiras Nefesh with Mordechai, there's another aspect, a higher aspect. That the Mesiras Nefesh is about sacrifice, but rather that our bodies are transformed. That instead of giving our lives away, our lives become a keli for Torah. And then he says, Ve'ikir avedase shel Mordechai. Moreover, the primary involvement of Mordechai, learn Torah with little children. And the Rebbe says, and this is taka on page Ayin Zayin, that there is no example of Mesiras Nefesh for learning Torah, which is about preserving the body, rather than sacrificing it, than learning Torah with little children. Because learning Torah with little children means that you're bringing godliness into the goof. Shehem Ayesei shall call Yisrael to the foundation of all the Jewish people. As the previous Rebbe explained at length in his Maamar, which is a Maamar of Mesiras Nefesh, to teach Yiddish Kinderlach Torah. Begedel miles Hebeltin Ekeshel Beis Rabban. What's outstanding about the air of the mouths of little children? That's called Hevel She'em Beichet. The Medrash says, Shekibitz Mordechai Hayehudim, Mordechai gathered Chov Beis Elef Talmidim, 22,000 disciples. V'limdam Torah b'Mesiras Nefesh, and taught them Torah with the Mesiras Nefesh, ad. And the Mesiras Nefesh was so strong, Shekshabo Haman Arasha, the evil man Haman came. Mordechai Omalhem, so Mordechai told the children, Baruchu lachem, escape. So he shouldn't kill you. You shouldn't be burnt by my coal. So the children told him, Itonu anachnu, we're with you, ben l'chaim ben l'moes, for life and for death. In other words, Shekiblu aleim kol einish yid. They were prepared to endure any kind of punishment. Ach verak, the only condition that they had was shalei lipared mi'atera, not to become separate from the Torah, and not to become separate from Moshe Rabbeinu. So these little children said they wouldn't leave, and of course you all know the hemshech, that Muhammad comes in and he says to Mordechai, why are you so happy? And Mordechai says, because I have a good besura, al tira v'pachat pisay, mutzuweitze v'sufer v'ziknanihu, and so forth. So it was an enormous amount of Mesiras Nefesh, which showed itself not only in the basics of Yiddishkeit, but in the specifics of Yiddishkeit, and it even showed itself in the children, in their guf. Says the Rebbe V'zeh, when this explains, I'm on the last 4 lines of the first paragraph on page Samaches. What is the meaning of Vkibel? The Jewish people reaffirmed, committed themselves to this. They started doing a Tarsinai Shematan Teira. When the Eibusha gave them the Torah, was only a beginning. Ubizman Gzeiras Haman, and the time of the decree of Haman Arasha. Hoisak Abola, that Mesiras Nefesh was the final affirmation. Kaidei Shaho Yolem Oz. Because since in the Purim story, they had Mesiras Nefesh, Bepeil, actual Mesiras Nefesh. Al Teiro Mitzvahs for Yiddishkeit, so the Rebbe says Nis'alu, and then parenthesis, Be'inyan Echad, they were elevated in one aspect. Le Madrega, Nailis, Yeser, Mikmoisha, Hoyu, Bezman Matan Torah. Of course, Matan Torah was an incredible event and a very high level, but in one aspect, Purim was greater. What aspect of that? That's the aspect of Mesiras Nefesh. And therefore, Oz Dafka. So then Dafka, Hoisak Abol, was the reaffirmation, Vkibel Hayehudim. Now, this is the basic point of the Maamar, that Purim in an aspect was greater than Matan Torah because of the great Mesiras Nefesh. What's the relevance of that? The relevance of that was because the point of Torah was Bittul HaGzeira, to break the division between heaven and earth. And to be mevatel the Gezerah, to break the division between heaven and earth, you have to have total Mesiras Nefesh, total bittul. because you have to go above what is below and above what is above and join them together. And only when there's total bittul can you be mevatel the gezeira of Hayehudim liyed tachteinim tachteinim liyal Hayehudim. Moreover, the bittul of the gezeira was not in such a way that there was supposed to be destruction of the Jewish people, but to the contrary, they should remain in their form, in their guf, and be kelim for learning the Eibishter's Torah. And this required a Mesiras Nefesh, and specifically a Mesiras Nefesh which was inspired and led by the leader of their generation, which was Mordechai. And of course, the Rebbe told us later in the Maamar that Nasav and Ishma is one level of Mesiras Nefesh, Chanukah is another level of Mesiras Nefesh, and Purim is the highest level of Mesiras Nefesh. So the incredible height of the Mesiras Nefesh of Purim is what makes it able to be the source of the bittul necessary for the total bittul exam. So now the Rebbe says in Siv Beis, V'tzorich lahavim, we need to understand. Harinekuda sabir ba'maimir, what the previous Rebbe explained in his Maamar, is the zeh shedafta b'gmana gezeira, the fact that exclusively in the time of Haman and the decree, hoitzak abolah, the Jewish people recommitted themselves to Torah mitzvah tzad Mesiras Nefesh alahem, because of their Mesiras Nefesh. So the question is, if during the time of Purim, Jewish people merited, because of their Mesiras Nefesh, to break that gezeiro, so the question is, why does it matter? Even if we understand that their Mesiras Nefesh makes them greater than Matan Torah, why does it have to point out that Mordechai was involved? Moreover, that Mordechai's business was learning Torah with little children. What does Mordechai in general and Mordechai's learning with little children have to do with this question? Gam tzarich lahavin. The third question is, I am now 6 lines from the bottom of page Tamaches. We need to understand bir b'mashakasa b'diuk b'atchalas hamayim, to explain what the Rebbe asked in the beginning of the Maamar. Dezeh shebizman matan Torah, the fact when the Eibishter gave us the Torah, hayu yisrael b'tachas ha'ila, the Jewish people were on the highest levels. Or bizman nagzeh hayu b'tachas ha'shifos, when the Eibishter made the decree they were in the lowest levels. Hu hein beruchnius v'hein begashmis, is both spiritually and materially. And the question is, since when is material important? The lecheira, arguably lahadiak shabbat Maamar, based on the way the Maamar is structured, the only thing that matters, the heichi toch, how could it be shabazman shahoye betachas ilui, when they were in the highest state by Matan Torah, hoyserakas chol was only a beginning, go be'eis shahoye betachas hashifas, and when they found themselves at the lowest ebb, oz dafke hoysakabal, they reaffirmed. So we understand that this idea that during the times of Purim, when they had this terrible decree, they overcame it, is negei ha'ili v'shifas b'matzav v'ruchni shalhem. It's important to point out how low their spiritual level was, and nevertheless they had Mesiras Nefesh. And the question is, v'lomo mevi b'hamaymer. Why does the previous Rebbe bring in his Maamar, sha'ilu shabizman natan Torah? The advantage at the time when the Torah was given, as opposed to v'ham shiflus shabizman nagazeda, and the lowliness at the time of Purim, when we say they completed what had only been begun at Har Sinai, Hagam Bagash, which was also physical. Now this question is answered on page I involved, the little paragraph. And the answer basically is because there's 2 concepts to the Mesiras Nefesh. One concept of the Mesiras Nefesh is sacrifice, and the other concept of Mesiras Nefesh is transformation. One concept of Mesiras Nefesh is that you no longer exist, so to speak. The second concept of Mesiras Nefesh is that your person is presented to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And Torah requires Mesiras Nefesh to break decrees, but Torah also requires that you should exist, so you should be able to learn it. So the Mesiras Nefesh of the Neshama is breaking the decree, and the Mesiras Nefesh of the Guf is making the Guf capable of learning Torah. And the Rebbe continues on line Samach Tes, V'hinei neisliv l'yukam d'liyol. There's additional observations. There's another question. Gam b'teichen abir shebahamaymer, the substance of what's explained in the Maamar, which is the Vkibel Hayehudim Hayehudim in the time of Mordechai, when the Jewish people reaffirmed their dedication to Torah mitzvahs. Who mipnei she'oz hoyel ha-Mesiras Nefesh al Torah mitzvahs, that Mesiras Nefesh for Yiddishkeit. And the question that Rebbe asks is the lechaeda. The argument is Hayehudim kekulam shalom mitzvahs. The vast majority of mitzvahs, ksiv, it is written ashiyasa eisam ha'adam v'chai b'hem. You're supposed to live in mitzvahs. The average mitzvah, if a Jew is told that the only way to keep this mitzvah is by losing his life, he's not allowed to give up his life. He's not allowed to keep the mitzvah. Yaver v'hayahodik. Do the aveda and don't lose your life. And there's only 3 avedas where we say yahodik v'hayaver. So what is the significance of being Mesa Nefesh? For every idea of Teda and mitzvahs, Mesiras Nefesh is only for 3. For Ga, moreover, Begim, Allah mitzvahs, these 3 mitzvahs. Shenemar behem yaharik val yaver, where the obligation is to give your life rather than transgress, which is idolatry, adultery, and murder. Einom inyan Mesiras Nefesh, the losing or the sacrificing of one's life. Not to transgress and do these avedas is not Mesiras Nefesh. This is how you fulfill these mitzvahs. Even if you're going to lose your life. And if you look in footnote 22, there's a reference to a very, very famous footnote of the Rebbe in the Maamar and Tafshin Tes, where he develops this whole subject of Mesiras Nefesh. The Rambam in the Hilchos Seder Teda, and then of course in the Igeres Hashmad, lists 5 different levels, I think, of Mesiras Nefesh and Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. Now, the Rebbe, in this essay, which he wrote as a footnote to Tafshin Tes, observes that there's at least 2 concepts of Mesiras Nefesh in Chassidus. The first is the concept of Mesiras Nefesh connected to these 3 Avedas, and the second is the concept of Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. And what's the difference? The difference is Mesiras Nefesh is a detail in the way you do a mitzvah. Hashem gave you a mitzvah not to murder. You're not allowed to murder even if it costs you your life. You know, it's like the word of Avraham Avinu. Avraham Avinu wanted to spread Yiddishkeit. If he would have to lose his life to do so, he would do it. But his focus was not on Mesiras Nefesh. His focus was on spreading Yiddishkeit. Similarly, for a person to sacrifice his life, not to murder, or to be idolatrous, or an adulterer, is a detail in those mitzvahs. It's not a part of Mesiras Nefesh. And the question, therefore, is, what does it mean being Mesa Nefesh for all of Teda mitzvahs? Being Mesa Nefesh for all of Teda mitzvahs is not a part of Teda. The instances where you're Mesa Nefesh for these 3 Avedas is first of all only for those 3. Second of all, it's not Mesiras Nefesh. It's fulfilling those mitzvahs to the extent that you're even willing to give your life away. So what is it about Purim, where Yidden and Mesiras Nefesh for all of Teda mitzvahs, how is that relevant? And he adds, "V'amitzvah de Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem." There's another concept, and the other concept is being Mesa Nefesh to sanctify the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Now, this is very interesting, because mitzvahs Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem means what? I am dying to make Hashem's name holy. And it's a mitzvah. And the way the Maamar of the Tafshin Tes goes is that the Friedrich Rebbe brings a Maamar from the Middle Rebbe, who says the Mesiras Nefesh is not one of the mitzvahs. So the Rebbe separates Mesiras Nefesh from Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. In other words, there is dying for a cause, not to do this sin or this sin or this sin, which is a mitzvah. And then there's dying not to sanctify the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, l'kadosh Shem Shamayim B'Rabim. Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem has very different rules. And as it turns out, you could be Mesa Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem almost for anything. If a guy wants you to do any Aveda, even the smallest Aveda, and it's B'Parhesi, it's in public, and his motivation for you doing that Aveda is because he wants to desecrate, he wants to violate, he wants to deface and defame Yiddishkeit. So the requirement is you have to be Mesa Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem for the smallest details. So the Rebbe argues, Mesiras Nefesh Stam is limited to 3 Avedas. Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem is a separate mitzvah. So the question then becomes, how is there a concept of Mesiras Nefesh for all of Teda and mitzvahs? There's Mesiras Nefesh for those 3 Avedas, which are detailed in those 3 Avedas. There's Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, which is an idea unto itself. Umahu ha'hechrich, and what is the necessity b'Mesiras Nefesh to sacrifice themselves in all of Teda mitzvahs b'shvil ha'kabbalah, in order to accept upon themselves Vkibel Hayehudim, the klolos ha'Teda, the Teda in its entirety. This is the question. It's not Mesiras Nefesh, it's not Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, so what is it? And the answer in the Maamar is that it's Bidl. The answer to this question is, we have Mesiras Nefesh not to do certain Avedas. You have Mesiras Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, to sanctify Hashem's name. And here he calls it mitzvah achas. And if I recall from that other Maamar, over there it's not a mitzvah, it's higher than a mitzvah. But the idea that Yidden are Mesa Nefesh for Klolos HaTeira VaMitzvahs, for all of Yiddishkeit, in the time of Purim, is about Bittul. That Yidden had to sacrifice themselves, had to be mevatel themselves completely in order to be able to get the Torah completely. Why? Because there's a gezerah, there's a divide, there is a split, that what's high can't come low, what's low cannot come high. In order for the two to fuse, you have to break these barriers. And to break these barriers, you have to go above both barriers, the barrier of what's below as well as the barrier of what's above. And this required Mesiras Nefesh. So this is not Mesiras Nefesh to fulfill certain mitzvahs. It's not Mesiras Nefesh to be Mekadosh Shem Shamayim Barabim, to sanctify the name of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's Mesiras Nefesh for the sake of Bittul. And the Bittul allows us to bring Torah into the world. And that's the meaning of what the previous Rebbe says in this Maamar, that Yidden completed what they started at Har Sinai through their Mesiras Nefesh. And it continues, Umashakos, so Betanya, is it not true that in the Tanya he also speaks about idea of Mesiras Nefesh, which took place when the Yidden left Egypt? The reason for this fact, that Moshe was instructed, and in turn he did instruct the generation of Jews who went into the Holy Lands, to read Shema twice every day, in the morning and at night. And Alter Rebbe in chapter 25 interprets that this was L'kabel of Malchus Shamayim b'Mesiras Nefesh, to accept upon themselves the yoke of the kingdom of heaven with Mesiras Nefesh. And the Alter Rebbe asks the question, what was the need to teach the Jewish people in the Midbar the idea of Mesiras Nefesh? Hashem promised the Jewish people that they had nothing to fear when they would come into the Holy Land. The Goyim they would meet would fear them. So why do you have to talk to a group of Jewish people who are being promised that the non-Jews around them would fear them? Why do you have to talk to them about Mesiras Nefesh? And the answer that the Alter Rebbe brings is Mipnei Shekiyim HaTeiro Mitzvahs, because the fulfillment of Teiro Mitzvahs totally depends upon the fact Sheyiskir Tomid Inyan Mesiras Nefesh LaHashem. You have to constantly remember the idea of Mesiras Nefesh. And of course this goes with the story, and I've told this to you a number of times. It's Tanya chapter 25 at the end, after the two dots. But the story is that when Dr. Zelickson got married, he got married in Kislev Toshin Yud Beis, which is less than a year after the Rebbe accepted the Nesias officially. It was the first Chanukah of the Rebbe's Nesias. And Dr. Zelickson got married in the hall, and the Rebbe went to the Kabbalas Ponim and spoke, and then he was by the Chuppah, of course. And the Sichas the Rebbe said by that Kabbalas Ponim were about Mesiras Nefesh and Chanukah. When Dr. Zelickson passed away, some 40 years later, his son, Michal Zol Gezun Zayin, published a biography of his father called Teldes Rabbi Avram Abba HaRoife, and he sent into the Rebbe a transcript of that Sicha that the Rebbe said by his father's Kabbalas Ponim, and the Rebbe was kind enough to edit it, and it was published in that Sefer, and then it's reprinted in Lekut HaSichas Chelek Lamed and the Yisafas. And in that Sicha, there's an interesting exchange. The Rebbe spoke, they're long Sichas. At the end of the Sicha, there were two Rabbonim, non-Lubavitch Rabbonim, who were Tzaddik Kala, like Zelickson's Kala's rabbis or community leaders and so on. And one of them asked the Rebbe, why is the Rebbe talking so much about Mesiras Nefesh? And of course, the way I understand their question was, it was just a few years after the Holocaust. So much Jewish blood had been spilled, the Jewish blood hadn't even dried yet. Why is the Rebbe talking so much about dying al Kiddush Hashem? And the Rebbe gave a very, very cryptic answer. The Rebbe said, quote, the Rebbe de Shver hat gesagt, as in America darf man reden wegen Mesiras Nefesh, which means my father-in-law, the previous Rebbe, said that in America you have to talk about Mesiras Nefesh. But the Rebbe didn't explain why. But in Tanya it explains why. When you live in a society where to be a Jew you have to make sacrifices, you don't have to talk about sacrifices, you have to just do it. When you live in a society where you have to make no sacrifices, then you have to talk about sacrifice. Why? Because when you live in a society where you don't have to make any sacrifice to be a Jew, you forget what a Jew is. What is a Jew? A Jew is a person who's prepared to die not to become cut off from Hashem. And when you live in a society where there's no risk of losing your life because of your relationship with Hashem, you have to talk about that. You have to talk about that concept that if we were living in a different country, we, not my grandfather, not my grandfather's grandfather, I and you and us, would be Meis Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. And it's a motivation for living as a religious Jew in your day-to-day life, which is what says in Tanya chapter 18, 19 until 25, that there's something called Ava Misoteres, that a Yid could be Frum, a Yid could be a Benyani, not by being Meis Nefesh, but by telling himself, if I'm ready to be Meis Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem, I'm certainly ready to control my Yetzer Hara. So the Rebbe says that the Jewish people who left Egypt were told Shema Yisrael, which is Mesiras Nefesh. So then, if they were already told Mesiras Nefesh, what's the Chiddush of Purim? So the Rebbe continues and he says, Ha'inyan Mesiras Nefesh. The level of Mesiras Nefesh, which was inspired of those Jewish people going into the Holy Land, which is going to motivate being a Frum Yid in your daily life. Hu Mesiras Nefesh b'koyach. It's only a Mesiras Nefesh in potential. It's a readiness. It's a giving away of one's will. That if and when there would be a need to be Meis Nefesh al Kiyum Ateiru Mitzvahs, who Muchal is prepared for it, but it's not happening. In other words, you're remembering the idea of Mesiras Nefesh not so you have to sacrifice your life. You're remembering the idea of Mesiras Nefesh so you should remember what a Jew is. That a Jew in a rich country, in a safe country, is still a Jew, and he still has an neshama, and if he is prepared to die al Kiddush Hashem, if he's in a difficult situation, how much more so that in such a comfortable situation, he should be dedicated to Torah and mitzvahs. But there's no dying involved, there's just koyach, there's the idea. And the Rebbe continues, and he says, a similar idea happened when they received the Torah, just like the Jewish people who went into the Holy Land, that were inspired to talk about Mesiras Nefesh. It wasn't that they were sacrificing their lives. They were discussing the concept of a sacrifice, which is called potential Mesiras Nefesh. The same is true when Hashem gave us the Torah, that Yisha Nasa v'Nishma. When the Jewish people said, we will do and we will hear. And as I said to you earlier, in Chassidus it says that Nasa v'Nishma both means Kabbalah Seil. Nasa means Kabbalah Seil Machas Shemaim, committing to God. And Nishma means Kabbalah Seil mitzvahs, committing to His mitzvahs. Umikol Shkein, and how much more so. La'acharesh and itztavu, when you add to the Nasa v'Nishma, a mitzvah saseh, likreis kriya shma pamayim b'chol yom, to read Shema twice a day, with the theme of Mesiras Nefesh. So certainly, this combination of Nasa v'Nishma and saying Shema was kiblu aleim l'kayim kol ma she'itztavu. In these two ideas, they accepted upon themselves to fulfill everything they're going to be commanded. Gam im yeh tzorech le'Mesiras Nefesh al zeh, if there be a need to sacrifice themselves. But be'afa pikein, still loy hoya Kabbalah gemura, it's not a perfect Kabbalah. Vkibel Hayehudim ad lezman gzeras haman, until the time of gzeras haman. Why not? Because at that time it was called Mesiras Nefesh b'keyach, and in the time of Purim, Mesiras Nefesh b'keyach, actual sacrifice. They actually gave their lives for HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Rebbe's question is, first of all, why do you have to have Mesiras Nefesh for all of Yiddishkeit? And second of all, why is it such a big deal that in the time of Matan Torah and going into Eretz Yisrael, it was, quote, only, end quote, Mesiras Nefesh b'keyach, and the time of Purim, it was Mesiras Nefesh b'Paltiel. What's the big difference between Mesiras Nefesh on a potential level and Mesiras Nefesh on an actual level? And again, the Rebbe is going to explain that there was an element of bittul, and there was even an element of hefker. In other words, when a Yid was Meis Nefesh in the Purim story, there was a recklessness about it. There was a total abandon of self, which doesn't exist when you calculate that you're going to keep Hashem's mitzvahs, even if you're going to give your life. And the Rebbe adds a middle level. When the Yidden got the Torah, and when they went into Eretz Yisrael, it's called Mesiras Nefesh b'Koyach, potential Mesiras Nefesh. By the Purim story, there wasn't only a Mesiras Nefesh b'Poel, it had a certain quality of Afkedus. It was reckless. What's in between those two? Mesiras Nefesh of Chanukah. We know that there were two times that Hoyus and Mesiras Nefesh b'Poel shall Klal Yisrael, that the nation of the Jewish people collectively were Mesiras Nefesh al Teiru mitzvahs. The first was b'Chanukah. Bezman Gezeidas Yav, on the time of the 3 of Yavin. And let me, of course, observe, Chanukah was not first. Chanukah was 200 years after Purim, right? It happens first in the calendar year, but Chanukah happened in the middle of the second Beis HaMikdash, and Purim happened between the two Batei Mikdash. Ube Purim Bezman Gezeidas Haman. And then Purim in the time of the decree of Haman. And I want to point out something else. Chanukah was not a Mesiras Nefesh that involved all the Jewish people. It involved only the Jewish people living in Eretz Yisrael. A very significant number of Jewish people were away in Bavel and in other places. And the arm of the Syrian Greeks couldn't reach them, and they were never at risk. They continued to learn Torah and to do mitzvahs and so forth. They didn't have any exposure to this Nisayan. Purim, Achashverosh was a Moshel Bekipa. The Gemara says he was one of the 10 who ruled over the whole world, and there was literally no place to run and hide. Nevertheless, here the Rebbe doesn't draw that distinction. He simply says, Mesiras Nefesh Bepoel Shel Klal Yisrael. And he continues, Vkibel Shekol Yonim Shel B'Teireh B'Tachas Adiyah. We know everything in Torah is absolutely precise, and therefore we have another question. The question is, it's not enough that Mesiras Nefesh B'Koyach isn't good, and you have to have Mesiras Nefesh B'Poyel, but in addition, it's not enough that you have Mesiras Nefesh B'Poyel like it happened Chanukah. You have to have Mesiras Nefesh B'Poyel like it happened Purim. The finalizing of our accepting of the Torah is Hayedafka the Mesiras Nefesh. The Purim is linked to an actual sacrifice of life, but specifically on Purim, and not on Chanukah. And it's not only chronological, that since Purim came first, so when Purim happened, they made this new commitment, and it was done, Elagam, but also the Purim, the sacrifice of Purim. Is more connected to the complete acceptance of the Torah. And the final question is, v'tzarech love, and the question is again, what is hachilog beina Mesiras Nefesh the Chanukah la Mesiras Nefesh the Purim? How is the Mesiras Nefesh of Chanukah not enough? And you have to have dafka the Mesiras Nefesh of Purim. Because of this distinction, Hagamad the Kabbalah Satayra, the time when we completed our acceptance of the Torah is dafka the Mesiras Nefesh the Purim. It's the Mesiras Nefesh of Purim and not of Chanukah. And of course, the answer that the Rebbe brings in the Maamar, and the answer to this question is found on the bottom of page Ayin Hey, and the top page Ayin Vav. And I already explained it earlier, because Purim, the Chanukah, the Jewish neshama was attacked. Their religious life was attacked. What they did was attacked, and they were being killed for the way they were living, and they calculated to die for what they were doing. Purim, they didn't attack what they were doing; they attacked them. And the Rebbe observed a very subtle point, which is perhaps difficult to understand, that although they were only killing Yehudim, they were only killing Jews who were diehards, who were kafir b'avodah zarah and made the b'kal Torah kula, who were dedicated to Hashem, denying idol worship and committing themselves to all of Torah and mitzvahs. But once they were Yehudim, they were not being killed for what they did, they would be killed from who they were. In other words, their body was attacked. Not their way of life, but their personality. So the Rebbe argues, Chanukah and Purim are superior to Nasav and Ishma and the Shema Yisrael of Deish and Nich and Sul Oretz, because those were Mesiras Nefesh B'Keach and these are Mesiras Nefesh B'Poyel. But he argues further that Chanukah was a Mesiras Nefesh B'Poyel where they calculated. They're dying for their Yiddishkeit. And Purim was a Mesiras Nefesh with the Hefkedus, because they were not dying for the Yiddishkeit, they were dying for who they were. And they just threw themselves away. And the Rebbe's point is, this is the only way Matan Torah could happen. In other words, this is not only about us accepting the Torah. It's about the Torah coming to us. In order for the Torah to come to us, the Gezerah between heaven and earth has to be totally shattered. And the way we can shatter the Gezerah between heaven and earth is by shattering ourselves. The bittul of the Jewish people in the Mesiras Nefesh of Purim broke that decree and allowed heaven and earth to merge, and they should reveal godliness into this world on the highest levels. And of course, as I explained to you in the beginning, another aspect of this is that it's actually ultimately not about dying, it's about living. Okay, so we learned now the first 3 prakim of the Maamar. We went through all of the questions, and we answered them all. And I just want to finish with one final little idea. And that is that, you know what the Gemara says, that mikan meida rabba le'eraisa, that the first 1,000 years of Jewish history, a Jew could have said that he's not obligated. Why? Because he has a meidah, he has a disclaimer. The disclaimer is I was forced. As it says in the Gemara, it's brought in the Maamarim, that kof aleim har kigigas, Hashem dangled har sineh over the head like a press and threatened to kill them all. And according to Hasidus, it doesn't mean literally wanted to kill them, but they experienced such an incredible revelation of godliness that in effect their free will was taken away or significantly, substantially curtailed. So any Jew could say, my Judaism is forced, so I don't want to do it anymore. But that's until the Purim story, because the Purim story is mamish the opposite. What did Hashem do in the Purim story? He forced Jews to abandon him. He forced Jews to abandon him. If you think about the Purim story, any Jew whose passport says Yehudi, he goes and he issues a new passport that it should say Ivri, is out of the woods. Haman wasn't killing Jews indiscriminately, he was killing Yehudim. He was killing Jews who were obstinate, he was killing Jews who were defiant. And Hashem said to the Jewish people, run! Why remain a Yehudi and lose your life? Become an Ivri and live to see tomorrow. And they refused. So in other words, by Har Sinai, he took away their choice and forced them to accept the Torah. By Purim, he took away their choice and was in effect forcing them to run away from the Torah. And they wouldn't run. So no Jew can say, I was forced. To the contrary, if Hashem did anything, it was forcing him to leave, and they refused to leave, this became our choice. And this is a very interesting idea. The Rebbe has a sikha on free will in the Sichos, where he asks a question. In Rambam, free will is in the laws of tshuva. And the Rebbe's question is, why does the Rambam put free will in the laws of tshuva? Isn't free will connected to all of Yiddishkeit? Why tshuva? And the answer in short is because tshuva is Mesiras Nefesh. And the true exercise of free will is not in your daily living. Because your daily living is logical, it's limited, it's explicable. The true free will is when you make total sacrifice. Tshuva is total sacrifice, therefore the laws of free will are included in the laws of tshuva. And this is what the point of the Maamar is. When Hashem forces a Jew to give away his life completely in order to be a Jew, that's a total exercise of free will, that it became ours. And the Midah Rabbah is removed. And that's why Purim is compared to Matan Torah. And you all know the Tikkun Ezeiah that says that, what is Yom Kippur? Yom Kippurim. Yom Kippur is they like Purim. And of course the question becomes, what does Yom Kippur have to do with Purim? And there's a lot of answers, by the way. And one of the critical answers is that Yom Kippur, the center of Yom Kippur was a goydel, was a lottery. And the center of Purim was Purim, which means a lottery in Persian. And the Rebbe has a sikha in Chelik Vav where he explains why we use dafka, a Persian word. But there's another reason. Because Yom Kippur, we got the second luchas. And Hashem says, Lach Tikit Varach. And Purim, we committed ourselves again to keep the second luchas. So Purim and Yom Kippur share a bond in as much as Torah is concerned. And nevertheless, we say Yom Kippur is less than Purim, because it's Yom Kippurim. How could you say that Purim is greater than Yom Kippur? And the answer is because by Yom Kippur, the holiest person goes to the holiest place on the holiest time. And by Purim, every single Jew was Mesa Nefesh al Kiddush Hashem. And as such, our accepting of the Torah was greater by Purim even than it was on Yom Kippur.